Hello everybody and welcome to Mr. Stansfield's Education Videos. Today we're taking a look at how to make a contact sheet or a positive of our film after we shoot. It's in a sleeve and we take a picture of it on a light table. So this is the process of editing that photo so that it becomes a positive so we can see what the images are going to look like when we make prints. So let's take our, first of all, take a photo of your film in the sleeve on a light table, get it in here into Bridge, and then open it up into Photoshop, and you're going to see something like this. Now, I always start by hitting the F key. That's not necessary for you, but it gives me a nice clean workspace, and that's often the workspace that I'm working with. Now, this particular capture, our particular light table that we use to capture this image, is not giving us consistent light. And I think most of us can probably look at the screen right now and see that the left side is a little bit darker than the right side. The right side's a little brighter than the left side. Now, I'm going to show you sort of a quick eyeball-ish way to resolve this. And the goal here is to make an adjustment here in Photoshop so that the left side becomes brighter and the right side stays the same, to try to even out the exposure a little bit. To do that, we're going to use layers and layer masks. So understanding what we're doing here with layers and layer masks, having done this before, is helpful. But if you haven't ever done this before, follow along. What we're going to do is go down here to the half circle, and you could grab any one of these four: brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. I'm going to go ahead and grab brightness and contrast because I think it's probably the easiest to use. Levels and or curves may be more precise, but we're going to do this fairly quickly. And what we want to do here is, in our Properties tab, is just brighten up the image. And what we're going to do before we start dragging the brightness slider over, what we're going to do is actually look right here visually on the screen at this side of the image, the brighter side of the image. And then we're going to go over here to our brightness, and we're going to drag that over to the right until the left side of the image matches the value or the brightness of the right side of the image before we make the adjustment. So that's why we sort of have to visually say, okay, where is this at roughly in my mind? I have to sort of think about that, and then I drag this up. Because what's going to happen is that the right side of the file will also become brighter, and in this case probably too bright. And so we're going to drag this up until the left side looks like how the right side did before we made the adjustment. Then we're going to use a layer mask, that's this white box down here on the brightness and contrast layer, to try to make the adjustment balanced so that it only adjusts to the left side. And we're going to do that with the gradient tool. And so I'm going to pause this here real quick. I just wanted to pause that so I can move my tools over slightly so that we can see. The tool that I want is the gradient tool, and that was hiding right beneath my stop sign here on the Loom recording. So the tool you want is the gradient tool. The shortcut key is to actually press the G key on the keyboard. If you press the G key on the keyboard, that should jump to the gradient tool. Now you'll also see, if I click and hold it, that the paint bucket tool and the 3D material drop tool, which is a tool I've never used, those are also G. So if you hit the G tool and you don't have the gradient tool selected, you can hold the Shift key and cycle through by holding the Shift key and clicking on G, G, G until you get to the gradient tool. Once you have the gradient tool, you should see the default, especially if you have the layer mask selected here. The default should be this white to black gradient, and the first box should be checked. If you have used the gradient tool for something else and you have some other selection up here, if you have the circular radiant gradient instead of the linear gradient for something like that, or your values here aren't white to black for some reason, you can resolve that by resetting the tool. I'm not going to go into that right now, but try to figure that out on your own. What we're going to do next is making sure that the layer mask is highlighted and selected. And the way to do that is to look at the four corners. So these four corners here in the tool, in the layers palette, are highlighted around the layer mask. Now you can see if I click on the adjustment, then now the adjustment is selected. Now the layer mask is selected. And what I'm going to do is drag from about, in this case, the middle of the photo, but your photo is it's gonna really depend on where you start clicking and where you start or where you end your click. You're gonna click and drag. I'm gonna click from about the middle to the right side of the image over here, something about like that. And the goal, what we're trying to do, and I think that worked pretty good. Now the right side is a little bit darker than the left side. We're going to resolve that in just a second. But what we have just done is we've added a gradient to the layer mask. Now I'm going to hold the Option key. You don't have to do this. I'm just going to show you the layer mask by holding the Option key and then clicking on it. The layer mask, the white part of the layer mask will reveal the adjustment or reveal the layer that you're on, right? So we made an adjustment, brightness and contrast in a layer. The layer mask, white will reveal the layer and black will hide the layer. So what we're doing here is the black and then the gray part is the gradient, right? So the black part of the image, the black part of the layer mask is hiding the adjustment. The white part is revealing the adjustment, and then that gradient, the gradient between light and dark, is kind of blending the adjustment. So I'm going to Option click again. Let's look at this. Here's before, and here's after. And I've done that by clicking on the eyeball on the brightness and contrast. Then I can show before and after the layer mask. Before we added the gradient, I can hold the Shift key and I can click on the layer mask to show here's before and after the layer mask. So I actually do think that my gradient is in the right place. It's about in the right place. But I do think the adjustment itself, if we click on the brightness and contrast down here, you can see in the Properties tab, you can see that brightness. We can actually adjust this after we make the gradient. So let's do that. In this case, I'm just going to bring this down a little bit until it's a little bit more balanced. There we go. So maybe somewhere around 90 or so gives me a fairly balanced. Now, does this need to be perfect? Absolutely not. But I wanted to show you this process as a way to balance the light if you have an inconsistent light table and you do this process that I'm showing you. If your light table isn't giving you even lighting, you can do something like this. You can make an adjustment and then use a layer mask to affect only part of the image. You could use a gradient. You could also paint this with a brush tool. There are a number of ways to do it. All right. Once you've balanced the lighting on the image, it's time to go to our the main event of this adjustment is actually to invert it. All right, that's what we're trying to do. Let's go down here now to the half circle and let's go to invert. It's the fifth from the bottom. And this will show us, essentially show us the positive from the negative. So we take pictures on film, they're negatives, and then we can invert them to make them a positive. And this is really what we're trying to do. Now, again, you can sort of see the inconsistency of exposure here. The left side is a little bit brighter now than the right side, but it's okay. It's not too big of a deal. We could go back and modify this brightness and contrast. We could modify the layer mask and the gradient, right? So you could sort of bring this up. You could bring this down a little bit. If you're looking for that balance, you can do that there. Now, this, if we use the zoom here, I've got the navigator open, but you could use shortcut keys. Command plus will zoom in and Command minus will zoom out. If we zoom in, we can start to get a sense of the images that we're looking at here, what they might look like when we make prints. Now, if you wanted to, you could make a further adjustment. I'm going to hit Command 0. That's the shortcut key to fit the image to the screen. If you wanted to do an overall brightness and contrast, that's not a bad idea. You can play around with this. You can make it a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, and that will change the way that your overall contact sheet here will look. You can increase the contrast or decrease the contrast as well. So if you were trying to get photos to show up, if they're a little bit darker, you can play around with that brightness and contrast. Now, interestingly, my brightness and contrast adjustment here was before, or rather under the invert, right? So I just moved that. If it's under the invert layer, then as you make it brighter, it's going to become darker because the inversion, the flipping of the values happens after the brightness and contrast. But if you move that above, then the brightness slider will actually work the brighter and darker as you kind of move it to the left. So increasing or decreasing the contrast and playing around with brightness overall. We're not going to add a layer mask to this. This is just to kind of take a look at those images. The last step is to crop the photo. Crop it kind of to the edges of the film. I like to leave a little bit of black there. Something like that looks pretty good to me. And then we're gonna save this. Now, I recommend saving this as a Photoshop document or a PSD file. And the way to do that is File, Save As, and then here you can choose, if your screen looks like this, you can click this little down caret here, navigate to your Google Drive or wherever you want to save it. In this case, I'm in the Downloads folder because I don't have my Google Drive set up on this computer. Make sure that the format is Photoshop. The Photoshop format should be the default if you have multiple layers. Rename your file, make sure you leave that .psd there, and then go ahead and save your work. I'm going to hit cancel right now, but you're going to go ahead and save. There's one more thing you may want to do, which is to get rid of any color in the image. In this case, there's a little bit of a green-yellow. So if I go here to the half circle again, I can add one more adjustment, either black and white or hue saturation. If I click on black and white, it turns it black and white, right? If you click, I'm going to undo that really quickly. If I go here to hue saturation, the way to do that is just to drag the saturation down all the way to -100, and you have functionally the same thing. It becomes black and white. So you can do either of those, and that will get rid of any color in the image. And this is going to give you an accurate reading of what we're going to have those images, what those images are going to look like when you print them in the darkroom. So there you go. There you have it. Make sure you save your work after you've kind of gone through all these adjustments. This is how to take a picture. This is how to edit a photo after you've taken a picture of your film on a light table. The purpose of this is to sort of create a digital contact sheet. Photoshop does have a contact sheet function in the tools. We've done that before, typically in my classes with digital photography. This is a way of taking a picture of the film and inverting the image so that you have a sense of what the pictures are going to look like before you make a print in the darkroom. Making sure to zoom in too, right? So Command plus will zoom in, and then Command minus will zoom out. So you can sort of zoom into the photo that you're thinking about making a print. You can sort of get a rough preview of what it's going to look like. Is it perfect? No, definitely not. But it is a pretty good way to see what the image is going to look like. And I do think it's better than the negative version, right? Like when you have your negative version like this, it's okay. You don't have, the way our brains work and the way our brains see things, you don't have a real accurate kind of preview of what the image is going to look like. So that's why we do this process. We want to invert it and then balance the exposure so that we can kind of see what these images are going to look like before we make prints in the darkroom. There it is.